Ethan Moore parked his car at the edge of Oakshade Cemetery, just as the last streaks of sunset faded into a bruised purple sky. The wrought iron gates, rusted and flaking, groaned when he pushed them open. A sudden chill ran through him, and he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The air smelled damp, earthy, and faintly metallic. He adjusted the camera strapped around his neck, telling himself he was here for a story, journalistic curiosity, nothing more. The cemetery stretched before him like a sleeping beast. Gravestones leaned at impossible angles, some cracked, some covered in moss, others shockingly polished as if recently tended. A thick fog had begun to settle, curling along the ground like creeping fingers. Every footstep he took seemed to echo louder than it should, swallowed and returned by the oppressive silence. Ethan's gaze drifted to the oldest section, where the stones were nearly blackened with age. He could see dates etched into the weathered marble, some from centuries past, some suspiciously recent. He frowned. Oakshade had been abandoned for decades. How could these graves bear names and dates that no local had reported? From the fog ahead, a figure emerged. Ethan froze. A man, tall and impossibly still, stood by a moss-covered crypt. His clothing was old-fashioned, a suit that might have been common in the 1950s, but the way he stood, almost perfectly motionless, head tilted slightly toward Ethan, set the journalist's nerves on edge. "Hello?" Ethan called, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. He felt a strange pull, a compulsion to step closer, yet every instinct screamed to run. A low groan came from behind him. Ethan spun, and a man emerged from the shadows, shuffling along the path. He was gaunt, almost skeletal, with eyes too wide and pale. "You shouldn't be here," the old caretaker rasped, voice barely above the wind. "Some visitors never leave, and some never should enter." Ethan swallowed hard, gripping his camera. I'm just here for a story. I want to understand." The caretaker shook his head. "You think you understand, boy. You'll see soon enough." He retreated into the fog, disappearing as if swallowed whole. The shadow by the crypt had shifted, closer now, though Ethan hadn't seen it move. His heart raced, and a whisper drifted from nowhere, brushing against his ear. "You can't leave." For a moment, he wanted to run, turn back to the car, escape into the safety of streetlights and asphalt, but the pull of the cemetery, the strange energy that seemed to hum beneath the gravestones, rooted him in place. Ethan raised his camera, the lens catching the dim reflection of the figure. Its eyes were empty, hollow yet searching. As night fell completely, the fog thickened, swallowing the path behind him. Ethan took a deep breath and stepped toward the figure, unaware that every step forward was a step deeper into a place where time bent and reality frayed, a place from which no visitor had ever truly returned. Ethan's footsteps echoed unnaturally as he followed the figure deeper into Oakshade Cemetery. The fog thickened with every step, curling around the gravestones and slipping through the gaps in the moss-covered crypts like living tendrils. The air grew colder, and a faint metallic tang filled his nose, making his stomach churn. He lifted his camera, hoping to capture evidence, but the figure always seemed a step ahead, gliding just out of reach. He stumbled upon a tombstone partially obscured by brambles. The name etched into the marble made his blood run cold. Arthur Hale, last visitor, 1954, never left. His hands trembled as he traced the letters with his fingers, the stone icy against his skin. A shiver ran down his spine. Could the figure before him really be Arthur Hale, a man who had supposedly disappeared decades ago? The fog shifted, and Ethan realized he was no longer certain which way he had come. Paths that should have led to the cemetery's exit twisted and bent back upon themselves, looping in impossible circles. Each turn seemed to bring him closer to the crypt, closer to the silent figure. Shadows stretched along the ground, elongating and contorting into grotesque shapes, whispering fragments of names and dates, victims of Oakshade's strange pull, perhaps, doomed to linger forever. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears as he whispered, "I need to leave." But even as he spoke, a voice, low, hollow, impossibly close, replied, "You can't leave." He spun around, but the figure had vanished. Only the fog and gravestones remained, though he felt its presence pressing on him from every angle. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. He realized the figure didn't just stand there, it mimicked him. When Ethan lifted his camera, he caught glimpses of a shadowy movement in his peripheral vision, matching his every action. Every time he looked away, the figure was closer, mirroring him with terrifying precision. A cold gust of wind brushed his neck, carrying a whisper that seemed to come from the very ground. "Join us. Stay with us." Ethan's heart leapt. He stumbled backward, nearly falling into a small open grave. Moonlight illuminated the disturbed soil, and he could see faint scratches inside, like desperate hands clawing at the earth from below. He turned to run, but realized with dawning horror that the cemetery itself had shifted. Gravestones had moved, paths had warped, and familiar landmarks disappeared into the fog. The exit he had come through was gone, swallowed into the mist. And then he saw it again, the figure standing just beyond a crooked tombstone, silent, still, and watching. This time its hollow eye seemed to pierce his very soul, beckoning him forward. Ethan's breath caught, and the weight of the cemetery pressed down on him. Somewhere in the distance, a faint, mournful wail echoed, carrying the sorrow of countless lost visitors. Ethan raised his camera again, hands shaking violently, determined to record evidence, but when he looked through the viewfinder, the figure was gone. In its place, the fog itself seemed to pulse, alive, whispering, and waiting. And in that moment, Ethan realized the terrifying truth. Oakshade Cemetery didn't want him to leave. Night had fully claimed Oakshade Cemetery. The fog was thick and suffocating, wrapping around Ethan Moore like a living shroud. Each step felt heavier, as though the very ground resisted him. Gravestones loomed unnaturally tall, their shadows stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. The air was filled with faint whispers, unintelligible but filled with menace, echoing in all directions. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest and sweat chilled on his skin. He stumbled across a mirror broken from a crypt wall, the shards reflecting fragmented images of himself. At first, it was just his own reflection, pale and terrified, but then the image images shifted. Hollow-eyed versions of himself stared back, mouthing silent screams. The cemetery wasn't just a place. It was alive. It was watching. It was consuming. A figure emerged from the mist, Arthur Hale, standing perfectly still, his hollow eyes locking onto Ethan. The shadows around him seemed to bow and twist in unnatural ways, forming indistinct shapes that whispered and moaned. Ethan backed away, only to find that the paths behind him had disappeared, replaced by an endless wall of tombstones. No matter where he turned, every route led back to the same spot, closer to Arthur and the central mausoleum. The caretaker appeared from the fog, his skeletal hands trembling as he gestured toward the crypt. "Oakshade chooses its visitors carefully," he rasped. "Curiosity is the key, and you've tempted it too far. You cannot leave until it decides otherwise." Ethan's mind reeled. He had come seeking a story, but now the cemetery was bending reality itself, trapping him. He ran, hoping to escape, but the fog thickened, slowing his movements. The whispers grew louder, becoming discernible, voices of the lost, men and women who had entered Oakshade and never left, calling his name, begging him to join them. He stumbled over an unseen root and fell hard, scraping his hands and knees on the damp earth. Desperation set in. He looked up and saw Arthur Hale standing just a few feet away, the figure's head tilting in that same unnerving way. But this time, something was different. Arthur's mouth moved, silently forming words that Ethan somehow understood. "You belong here now, just like the others." A sudden, horrifying realization struck Ethan. The cemetery wasn't just trapping bodies, it trapped souls. Every shadow, every whisper, every contorted form he had glimpsed was part of Oakshade's collection, and now it was beginning to claim him. Ethan tried to resist, shouting, swinging his arms, anything to break the invisible chains. But the fog surged forward, cold and heavy, pressing against his chest. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse, as though the cemetery itself had a heartbeat. And then he saw them, past visitors rising from graves, their hollow eyes fixed on him, moving slowly, inexorably, toward the crypt. He ran one last time, but every exit twisted back to the same mausoleum. His breath came in ragged gasps, fear threatening to overwhelm him. Somewhere deep within the fog, a whisper carried clearly, chilling him to the bone. "Once Oakshade claims you, you never leave." And in that instant, Ethan realized the full truth. The cemetery wasn't just a place of the dead, it was a predator, and he was its prey. Ethan Moore stumbled into the heart of Oakshade Cemetery, gasping for air, his legs trembling beneath him. The mausoleum loomed ahead, massive and ancient, its doors blackened with age. The fog swirled thickly around it, twisting and curling like dark fingers, carrying the faint whispers of countless lost visitors. Somewhere in the distance, a mournful wail echoed, a sound of despair that made Ethan's chest tighten. Arthur Hale stood silently at the mausoleum's steps, his hollow eyes fixed on Ethan. His presence radiated a cold inevitability, as though he had been waiting all these years for this moment. Ethan raised his camera, hands shaking, but the lens captured nothing, just the impenetrable black of the crypt. A voice, low and hollow, echoed through the fog. "You can't leave. Not now. Not ever." Desperation surged through Ethan. He spun, searching for any path that might lead him out. Every direction twisted back, every exit swallowed by the moving fog. Gravestones shifted, lining the paths like silent sentinels, and shadows began to rise, forming the indistinct, contorted shapes of the cemetery's previous victims. Their hollow eyes followed him, reaching, whispering, tugging at his very soul. The caretaker appeared, emerging from the mist as though stepping out of another time. "Curiosity," he said, voice brittle yet firm, "is what Oakshade feeds on. And you have asked too many questions. Now you belong to it." Ethan's heart pounded. He realized that the stories of Oakshade weren't just rumors, they were warnings. The cemetery didn't just trap bodies, it ensnared souls, bending reality, folding time, and collecting anyone who dared to probe its secrets. He tried to run, but the fog pressed against him, the ground trembling beneath his feet. Arthur Hale extended a hand, beckoning. Ethan felt an irresistible pull, an overwhelming weight in his chest, as though the cemetery itself had reached into him. He stumbled forward, resisting, fighting against the inevitable, but every step only drew him closer. The shadows of the previous visitors reached out with skeletal hands, brushing against his arms, whispering his name, whispering, "Stay, stay forever." In a final act of terror and resignation, Ethan raised his hands in defeat. The mausoleum doors creaked open slowly, revealing darkness so deep it seemed to swallow all light. The shadows surged forward, dragging him toward the entrance. The whispers became screams, the fog became suffocating, and he felt himself dissolving, becoming part of Oakshade itself. Outside, the caretaker walked past the crypt silently, his eyes empty. The wind carried the faintest sound of footsteps approaching, the next visitor, drawn by rumor, curiosity, or dare. The cemetery waited patiently, its fog curling like a predator, its gates wide open, welcoming the newcomer. Inside the mausoleum, Ethan's hollowed face stared blankly from the shadows. He had become another guardian, another whisper among the tombstones. The fog shifted again, and in its folds, new footsteps echoed. Oakshade never let anyone leave. It never had. And now, it had another story to add to its collection.